Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of our Ask the Experts series at First Service Residential. Today, we'll be talking about certainly a critical and timely topic around condominium structural integrity. We've all heard about the very unfortunate partial collapse of a condominium building in Surfside, Florida, and certainly our hearts go out to all the victims and their families and everyone that's been impacted in every way. And so first we'll start with just that note and recognition. As we've all been glued to the news reports, we're wondering, our residents are asking the question, the board members are asking the questions, how do we know our buildings are safe? Very basic, simple question. My name is Bill Worrell, and I am a director here at First Service Residential. I'm honored today to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. We have a few housekeeping items before we begin and before I introduce our esteemed panel. Number one, at the bottom there, you'll see the Q&A button. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do feel free to submit them into the session. We'll get to as many questions as we already have received and questions we receive throughout the webinar. Anything that we don't have time for today, certainly we'll circle back with you, particularly if they're building specific questions. As well, feel free to take notes, but you don't have to take notes as usual. We will be recording today's session. We will make that recording available to all attendees and those interested. So this is probably the most important session we've hosted to date, with advice that every board member should put into practice immediately. That's our goal today, is that everyone can take away something for their building, a process, a next step, some thoughts around bringing peace of mind, safety, and security to you and your residents. As you know, First Service Residential is a property management company and certainly not licensed structural engineers that provide structural engineering guidance for our clients. And that's why what we are offering today as a leader in the industry is a panel of experts in structural integrity, legal, including licensed structural engineers, to provide you with best-in-class information to keep your buildings safe. So now I'll introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. First, we have Mr. David Haber. David is a community association attorney of Haber Law. David, good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Bill?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. And next, Mr. Henry Handler, also a community association attorney with Weiss, Handler, and Cornwell. Henry, thanks so much for being with us today.
Bill, thank you very much for sponsoring this and for inviting me to participate.
It's my pleasure. Sanisha Kalar. Sanisha is the executive vice president at the Falcon Group, which is an engineering firm. Sanisha, thank you for attending.
Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. And finally, Greg Main-Bally. Greg is the executive managing director of Colliers, an engineering firm as well. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you. So as North America's property management leader, we'll set the stage here. We know the enormous responsibility that rests on the shoulders of condominium association board members. And we're here to support and help guide through that process when it comes to keeping your building safe. And we're here to help guide you through that, as I mentioned. Our panelists are here today to answer the pressing questions, subject matter experts, those questions that are being asked right now. So let's go ahead and get started. Sanisha, we're going to start off with you and then Greg. So let's set the stage here for a typical building. From a high level, walk us through, Sanisha, what criteria should we consider to determine if our building is at risk, any risk at all, of structural stress? And we're thinking about here, let's talk about the age, the location on the ocean, et cetera. If you could kick us off with what that criteria should look like.
Sure, thank you very much. So when we talk about the structural stability of the buildings, obviously everything starts with the design, and by virtue of how we design and build the buildings, they go to several checks. So once the building is built, every assumption that there is and every inspection or check that should have been made is assumably done, and therefore the building should be saved by that. So when we go into buildings that are now in operation for 10, 20, 30 years and are being occupied and used in various instances, the age, the location, the height, all play a role in determining the current structural stability of the building. For most parts, we are really concerned about the general structural stability of the buildings. Most of the times, we are discussing things that are in the realm of wear and tear in normal things that we expect on the buildings, such as some spalling and corrosion on the outside of the buildings, on the balconies and things like that. With a consequence in this area, in this environment of salt, air, sun, and things like that. The structural issues are oftentimes, when we are ever, and very rarely, luckily, we are presented with those, usually give us enough time to react and are manifested through excessive cracking, movement of the building, breakages of pipes and things like that. Things that give us enough signs, enough telltales that we can react and have time to react. So those are some of the things we will be looking for when we are looking for structural stability of the building versus what I again would call a expected wear and tear.
And so our audience, Anisha, and I'll shift over to Greg now, today includes folks all the way from Alabama and Tennessee, all the way down through Georgia, and of course, Florida, East Coast and West Coast. Any thoughts on the age of the buildings, but of course also the location? Can you walk us through and debunk any myths with regard to a building that's on the ocean or a building that's in downtown Atlanta, for example? Give us some of your thoughts.
Well, so we are obviously in the state that has the most coastline, and we are exposed to the ocean. So every single one of our buildings is going to have some form of chloride effect on it, i.e., we all know what happens to steel when it is exposed to salt. It rusts, right? And we are in a scenario, and every building is in the scenario that they will show signs of fatigue. And it's when those signs of fatigue are ignored that we typically get into a scenario of degradation. All right, so what Sinisa is saying there in the layman terms is preventative maintenance is extremely important. The more you ignore something, the worse it is going to get. Now, with specific buildings on the ocean, the longer or the older the building, the more chlorides have the ability to penetrate the concrete and start showing signs of deterioration throughout the property. And those would mostly be in the exposed surfaces, i.e. open parking garages, balconies, things of that nature. So when you recognize something of that nature, it is time for preventative maintenance. And that should be something that should be seriously looked at and undertaken.
Now, when we walk a building, and the point with regard to preventative maintenance is very well taken. Some buildings have had excellent preventative maintenance programs over the years. They're ahead of the game. Other buildings we've seen have not had those preventative maintenance programs in place, and there's some catch-up work to be done. And that's what we're looking at.
Bill, one of the points that I would like to make with respect to preventative maintenance that I know you're very well aware of is the fact that some of this stuff is not very sexy. It doesn't increase your fair market value, if you will. When people come into a building, they look at the lobby, they look at the marble floors, they look at the inside of the elevator cabs. Nobody's going in, or nobody has in the past gone into the parking garage to make sure that rebar that was corroded has been repaired or that the waterproofing on the pool deck was properly fixed. But those structural elements, which really are the lifeblood of a building, are things that have to be kept up and obviously in older buildings remediated. But there has been in the past tremendous pushback from owners wanting to spend millions and millions of dollars in areas such as that.
It's an excellent point, David. And as we walk through preventative maintenance, Sanisha and Greg as well, I'd like you to comment on this specifically. Preventative maintenance is seen by most folks in every building as when they go through the common areas like David just mentioned. There's the lobby, the fitness center, the corridors, the hallways, the pool deck. These areas all have finishes on them and they look beautiful and they look clean, ideally. Take us through specifically where you like to walk a building. And we like to look at back of the house, mechanical rooms, the areas that are not exactly covered up with finishes, as well as through the parking garage, back to what Sanisha mentioned, how the building is designed. Sanisha, can you start us off there? Give us some specific areas that the board members, engineers, property managers should be walking and looking outside of what everyone sees every day.
Sure. So when we talk about the buildings and structural systems, we have to talk about the vertical support systems, which are your columns, and then your beams, and then we're talking about horizontal, which are your slabs. So those two have different impact of the performance of the building. The point is, when we are trying to establish a structural stability of the building, we want to focus on the columns and on the beams, which means everywhere we have those exposed is what we want to start inspecting. If your building has a garage under the building, we want to check those columns. We want to see those columns. We want to touch those columns. We want to see they have cracks, any specific pattern of cracking that would, indicate structural stress versus a corrosion as a result of assault. Those have different type of cracking, and they can tell to a professional those signs and types of cracking can identify we have a bigger problem or a smaller problem. The slabs are something that we most often repair on the buildings. Every time you start seeing corrosion on the slabs, pieces of concrete falling, aside from that, being a problem, that's also a life safety concern, because pieces of concrete falling from the building could be, damaging the property or injuring or even, killing a bystanders or people under the building. So this is a very serious thing that is often taken rather lightly because it's implied that it doesn't cause serious problems. Waterproofing on the pool decks is probably one of the most overlooked issues that we are seeing, simply because it's often buried under the deck, under the pavers, under the topping slabs and all of that. And we only start reacting to that waterproofing when we start seeing water in the garage. Very rarely we're gonna act based on the lifespan of that waterproofing or anything like that, because it's an expensive project, not because of the waterproofing itself, but because of the overburden. Those are the things we wanna know. We wanna know the history of the property. We wanna know the age of all these components, and obviously actual physical inspection, again, first of the columns and the beams, and then exterior envelope of the building.
So Greg, add on to that if you don't mind. Sanisha talked about what is apparent and easily visual, but it sounds like there's some other stuff behind the surface as well that you want to look at. When should board members get this question is coming through again just now? When do you think board members should think about hiring a structural engineering firm to do this review of their building? 10 years, 20 years? Certainly we all know about the 40-year certification. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, the 40 and 50-year certification and every 10 years subsequent to that is only currently mandated by Dade and Broward counties. And everywhere else throughout the state, it is on the volition of the community and the residences to maintain their asset themselves, right? But quite honestly, you can see severe degradation within a 5-year term, depending on its exposure to oceanside, windborne chlorides, if it's underneath a pool that has a leaking mechanical or equipment room that's pushing chlorine again through the slabs. As Sanisha mentioned, waterproofing on balconies that hasn't been cleared by the condo association, that individual unit owners have just gone in and tiled over it and put new tile over a balcony that then is being inundated with water. So, from that perspective, you really have to define between preventative maintenance, right, which is a term that we keep on hearing, and major concrete restoration. There should be a very defined term between those two items. Now, your building engineers and property managers are the ones with the most knowledge of your building, i.e. they know all the skeletons in the closet. And specifically what we're talking about here is the skeleton, i.e. the structure, the skeleton of your building. And anytime you have an issue with your knee, your ankle, or whatever it is, you go and get it checked out because you don't want that skeleton to degrade. And in most cases, you go and get a second and a third opinion, right? So from that perspective, just in walking up on a building and visiting a new building, I'm immediately looking at the open faces, the balcony edges, looking for any signs of repeating major deterioration. And signs of major deterioration are going to be rust coming from the edges of the balconies, the post pockets. And it's not just on one balcony, it'll be multiple areas. You'll start seeing a recurring issue. And if you see it recurring in multiple areas, it needs to be addressed. You cannot keep on walking up to that building every day, keep on seeing the same thing getting worse and worse, and think that it's going to be cheap by the time you address the scenario, right? The other aspect of things is walking into those exposed spaces that Sinisa had mentioned. If there is a piece of concrete bigger than the size of your hand that is delaminating off of a column or off of a beam or somewhere, get it addressed by your local structural engineer or engineer of record that has familiarity with your building. It is far better to spend money early on than get caught out with a major issue 2 and 3 years down the line. In other words, penny wise, pound foolish. More is less.
So what I think I'm hearing, and I want to bring Henry in here, and then I want to flip over to David. What I think I'm hearing is it's not necessarily the age of the building. It has everything to do with architectural modifications, preventative maintenance. Have we kept up with the various painting programs over the years? What are folks doing to the outside of the building, the envelope, hanging the chairs from the slab or on the balcony, et cetera? That's penetrating the envelope of the building. So Henry, when a client asks you, and this is the question today, should we have our building inspected? Should we go out and hire an engineer? What are your thoughts, and how do you guide them through that process?
Bill, of course, the primary thinking and serious responsibility undertaken by directors and officers is the protection and welfare of the members of the association. There are other sources of pressure, Bill, that mitigate toward more immediate attention to this kind of reserve study or analysis, because there are other partners in the real estate business, real estate industry, maintenance business, in terms of insurance agents who are getting pressures themselves to look to see what record keeping there is by the association in terms of repair logs, in terms of undertaking reports, in terms of how they account for leaks and how the association responds to leaks. The insurance, we find some clients who are renewing insurances, and with some clients are getting action letters from insurance companies about what are they doing in introducing our clients really for the first time to some more obscure provisions that are being cited by the carriers about maintenance of the structure that is being insured. So we find that brokers are a little more concerned because insurances that are insured, mortgages insured by FHA or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they have regulations that require a review and introduction of history of building maintenance and record keeping. And we believe that insurance companies, especially in Florida, are going to be sharpening down on what an association is doing in terms of undertaking a reserve study and having the appropriate specialized consultant with regard to proper maintenance of the building.
Now, great points. David, I'd love to pull you in here on the insurance aspect as well. What are you seeing out there in the market?
I think much like Henry said, and much like the engineering expert said, people are concerned, not just the residents and the boards, but the people insuring the buildings, the brokers. To answer the question directly, which was asked, if I had a high-rise building today and I had not had a structural engineering inspection in the last 5 years, in light of what happened in Surfside, which is obviously tragic, and I'd like to point out, none of us here know what the actual cause or causes of that tragedy were, but we do know that they were in the 40-year certification process. We do know that there was corrosion in the garage on the columns, and we do know that the pool deck needed to be replaced and the waterproofing was really insufficient at that point in time. I think you need to have a structural inspection by an engineer. You should have someone looking at your balcony slabs. You should have someone looking at your pool deck waterproofing. You should have someone look at your garage, structure. Too many buildings see leaking planters for years and don't do anything about it because it's so expensive to rip out the plants, redo all the waterproofing. Same thing with pool decks. You have to rip up all the tile. You have to tell people they can't use the pool for 6 months or a year. The politics of this is very difficult. However, I believe that lenders and I believe that insurance companies going forward are going to be asking questions that have never been asked before, which is, what are your reserves? What does your reserve study show? It's not just going to be a person walking through the unit and saying, wow, you have shiny appliances. This unit is worth $400,000 compared to the other units that are worth $350,000. I think they're going to start looking at the building more systemically. I think insurance carriers are going to start drilling down, as Henry said, on insurance issues, reserves. Is the building properly insured? Does it have enough insurance? And if you're a board member, make sure you give disclosure to your insurance carriers. The number one thing they teach us in law school is disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. You don't want to be in a situation where you have failed to disclose claims between unit owners over leaks, leaks coming down from one unit to the other through the curtain wall or window wall system. You don't want to not disclose an engineering report. These are the things that are important to disclose to avoid a problem if a claim does come up.
Some sage advice,
Bill,
David. Go ahead, Sanisha.
I just want to, I think that one of the questions was how soon or how often should we have an engineer? And obviously we don't know the changes in the code or in the certification process that are coming. But I think that a good rule of thumb is that every time you paint a building, at minimum, you should have somebody perform an inspection. Painting cycle for buildings is roughly 8 to 10 years, depending on the location, type of paint you use. So in my opinion, every time you're ready to paint the building, and you should do it on a regular basis, which goes back to what David said about reserves, I think that's also giving you a guideline as to how often you should do it. But at that point, use that opportunity to have an engineer inspect the building, inspect the facade, inspect the garages, and tell you if there's anything else that can be addressed and should be addressed.
And yes, Anissa, I concur completely. And if I could, you mentioned previously, I believe, an ASTM standard that actually denotes whether something from a conditional aspect is preventative maintenance wise and or catastrophic or needs immediate attention. That it's not just the look of one column in one geography. It's a synopsis and an understanding of what is going on within the structure itself, which is more in depth than your typical reserve study. It is a physical ASTM standard that is considered a condition assessment. Sorry to interrupt, Sinisa.
Right, no, that's perfect. So Greg, stick with that, and Sanisha, when you do an inspection, and a great rule of thumb for everyone to take away. Certainly if you have concerns today, you want to do this sooner than later, but great rule of thumb, every time there's a paint job, 7 to 10 years is typically what we see. To add that to that scope of work and to begin the process. What does that look like for a board? What is the output? What is the work product from an engineering firm that they should expect? Is it pictures? Is it a written report? Could you walk us through that, exactly what they should be looking for?
Yeah, look, you know, I said earlier on in the conversation, penny wise, pound foolish, and more is less. Okay. And you've got to realize that in the for-profit commercial development space, anytime a building is traded, much like you go and buy a single family home, you have to have a property condition assessment and evaluation of the property and inspection. And that typically ends up determining your insurance costs and or whether you can even get leverage on that asset, right? So if you look at most commercial buildings, functions like that take place on about a 5 to 10 year period where the building is trading and you're constantly negotiating as to the condition of the building and what you might have to commit in cash up front to bring that building to a sellable standard over the term of your hold. And I cannot tell you the number of times how many boards, being their own worst enemies, get concerned and or scared of the potential expense with regard to a project, right? And they typically will only they will go and get 3 proposals from someone like Sinisa, and it'll have a portion of destructive and investigatory type testing that is typically a pretty sizable number, over $10,000, depending on the size of your building, if not more. And the number of people that'll make a decision to go and get one of those opinions for a building that's worth $50, $100 million and not get a second opinion. All right. Everything that you see in these restoration projects, as you've heard, is unforeseen conditions. Everything that is skeletal in nature is where the majority of the spend is. And you cannot quantify that unless you go and do a very, very thorough investigation. And in that onset, you're going to get Sinisa and or most of the engineering companies in the local environment come out and hang a swing stage and do a level of sounding and testing that's going to give you an idea as to how much implicated value there is there. But I would do that on multiple occasions, get 2 or 3 opinions, because the more dollars you spend upfront in defining what the preventative maintenance or the concrete restorative nature of the project is, the more consistent you'll be in its delivery and containment of that budget and spend.
So get a second opinion.
Bill, I'd like to address a couple of the questions that just came in about rebar. There was a comment that the New York Times and the Washington Post said that the developer of the Surfside building may have skimped on rebar. And the question was, should we have our rebar x-rayed? Another question came in about, does it matter if we're on the intracoastal versus the ocean? And a third question came in about how often are these recertifications going to be in the future? And I'll try to answer in reverse order. The state is going to make changes because there is no statewide mandate right now on recertification. Some people are talking about every 20 years and then 5 or 10 years thereafter. We don't know yet what it's going to be, but I would presume it's going to be less than 40 years, and I presume it's going to be less than 10 years thereafter. In terms of coastal environment, remember, whether you're on the intracoastal, whether you're on the ocean, whether you're 5 miles inland, Florida has a lot of salt air coming in, and that's a corrosive environment, as the engineers have said. And in terms of x-raying your columns, I would like for Sinisa and Greg to talk about the signs of fatigue that might lead you to X-ray a column if it's showing signs of fatigue? Because that's really an engineering question, not a legal question.
Sinisa, go for it, man. I'll translate afterwards if you like.
Sure, not a problem. So, as I said in my introduction, the design of the building is something that goes through a verification and permit and all of that. So the assumption is at the time that when the building was designed, it was designed properly. Also, the building goes through an inspection process during the actual construction, which verifies whether the reinforcement and rebars that were supposed to be put there by plans are actually installed on site. Same goes for the quality of the concrete. Now, we can go and discuss, and I'm sure that's going to be a part of discussion, whether those inspection services and verification and checks that we are doing today were the same as, are the same as ones that, were done 40, 50, 60 years ago. There is a notorious beach sand comment and building being built with a beach sand, and, that's corrosive in its nature. Again, the buildings are designed with a certain level of safety factor, with a certain level of redundancy in the design. We don't design buildings exactly for the amount of loads we expect. We always design for somewhat more. That comes from the type of materials we use, that we cannot confirm exactly the properties of the materials we're going to get, things like that. So engineers, in the virtue of by designing a building, always design for more than what we actually expect, which then leads us to understand that when the building is going through a stress, to a process that is not natural to the building, that is something the building cannot handle, building or a portion of the building, that we are going to start seeing signs of that happening through either excessive cracking or a particular type of cracking. Every type of stress on a building, whether it's a column or it's a beam, gives a certain mark that we can interpret and translate to what type of things are happening with a building. Checking for the amount of rebar in the columns, checking for the amount of rebar in the beams, in the slabs, and so on and so forth. I would recommend doing that if we start seeing cracking, if we start seeing patterns of something happening that would be indicative of a structural failure that would, lead us to believe that there is a problem with the rebar. We also have to be very careful. A lot of times we say, well, we only need to check the concrete. What is the compressive strength in my concrete? Is this the same as it was 30 years ago? Is it something that is sufficient or good? Sometimes we can do more harm than good by doing that. The only way to properly check the concrete is to do a core samples in the concrete. And sometimes people just drill into the columns. By drilling into the columns, we are now reducing the overall cross-section of that column, and we are creating punctures where they were not before, to check whether we have. So some of these things really have to be taught carefully, analyzed before we go and start doing this. There are non-destructive ways of checking this, and that's why I say, when you start, first of all, if you start doing this on a 10-year schedule or 7 or 8 as your paint schedule is, going back to something what Greg said, and that is, when you are supposed to paint the building, and we're talking about a high-rise or mid-rise building, the only way you can do that is through a swing stage, which means you're going to go through an expense putting that swing stage all around your building.
That's right.
That's a good chunk of money. Whether you're going to pay an engineer to do a big assessment before you start the project, or you're going to have an engineer during the actual paint project, checking everything at that time, but you have to have an engineer that is going to be checking your building at either point of time, before or after, or some, or both points of time, to check that. And then your engineer is going to be able to tell you, hey, listen, we see some problems that are not characteristic for what we expect to be a corrosion of the building. And it indicates structural stress. And because of that, we need to do further investigation, which may be a core sample, which may be epicometers to check the even X-rays and things like that.
But Sinisa, it's not uncommon. I mean, as a construction attorney, I can tell you it is not uncommon when you're doing a paint job. you always check your sealants around the windows and sliding glass doors, because water and salt air with corrosive water will get inside. It'll go down behind the stucco. It'll delaminate the stucco. It'll get to the concrete. All of those things are checked and should be remediated as part of what Greg calls, checking the body, if you will, the skeleton. I call it changing the oil on your engine. If you change the oil regularly, you won't end up with a failure of the block, and you won't end up having to buy a whole new engine. Part of that includes the sealants. Sealants and waterproofing are huge when it comes to concrete and avoiding distress and wear and tear on the concrete. The other thing that you'll find is there will be cracks in the stucco over time. Florida is a very hot environment, and the walls and the heat that comes to these windows, and experts correct me if I'm wrong, it ends up getting over 130 degrees. So you have to have those sealants. You have to fix those cracks in the stucco. If you see distress on the balconies while they're on the swing stages, that's the time to fix the rebar on the balconies. That's the time. All of you that have balconies have post pockets. You look inside the post pocket. Most of them, after a period of time, the water sits in the post pocket and starts deteriorating the concrete around it. When they're doing the swing stage work, that's when they fix the post pocket. So what Sinise is talking about is a comprehensive approach to the skeleton of the building, which should be done while you have that expensive swing stage up, and while you have your engineer looking at everything to say, it's not just a paint job. There's more things you need to do.
Right, David, thank you. Greg, go ahead, jump in on this.
Yeah, so Bill, Sinise brought up a good point, and so did David. You folks have to think of this like your car and your service manager, right? Your car is going to tell you, and so does the manual on your car, when you need items taken care of. Your brakes will tell you. They'll start squeaking, okay? The engine will overheat. You'll lose a radiator. It'll start blowing steam. It'll tell you before there's a catastrophic failure. And that is exactly what Sinise is trying to say, folks, is that these buildings don't all of a sudden, from one day to the next, even 1 year to the next, suddenly come up with a major issue that requires immediate repair. This is a slow, long-term degradation. Now, let me just put some fears aside here from some general construction rules of thumb, okay? Chlorides in the environment and rust in a building is something that has been known about for a very long time. We are in a corrosive environment. It has been addressed through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and all the rest of it, to the point that in the 2000s, they started putting almost a stainless steel type of rebar in the balconies to get away from the corrosive aspect of what was going on the ocean-facing frontage of some buildings up and down Sunny Isles Beach. To a second point, concrete gets stronger over time unless there is something that is physically affecting its ability to maintain its structural integrity. All right. And it is a symbiotic relationship between concrete and steel that holds up our buildings. Concrete compressive strength is exactly that. Steel is tensile strength. And unless something in that symbiotic relationship is failing, it'll start showing you those stress signs that Sinise is referring to. Now, for those of you that want the layman term, when steel starts to rust, it expands to approximately 10 times its original size. So if you get chloride penetration within any sectional members, columns, beams, or whatever it is going to start telling you what's happening and that chlorides are there, in which case you get a hold of that engineer and he comes in and does destructive testing. Now, one of the big blaring questions that's always on my mind that Sinise spoke to is, is my building safe? 9 times out of 10, your building has been over-designed. All right, 30% over-designed in their minds. I've always tried to get an idea of severity on it, right? So from that perspective, you folks need to realize that they are not designing to the cheapest spec or the minimalist function in these high rises up and down the beach. There is a lot of thought, a lot of engineering, and a lot of regulatory process that goes into monitoring of the building itself from a settlement perspective, as well as your neighbors. So just because you have a building being built next door does not mean that your residence is
Right.
in danger, right?
Right.
There are professionals that have been hired to negate those functions and those risks as construction is happening.
So just some of the
Bill,
key.
we're discussing some very high level expert testimony and explanation of very real issues and problems for associations. I think that David and I would also recommend that these discussions start to be incorporated through an expert hired by the associations with the help of its management company like First Service, in order to introduce these issues in preparation for the prelude of organizing and contracting for a reserve study to help justify the reserves that the association needs to adopt. And one of the things that we would like to communicate is now is not the time for directors to be to shy away from their continuing service on a board. There are these kinds of professionals, once properly vetted, who can help prepare the tools that the condominium directors can implement in order to get these kinds of studies, examination, and corrective implementation going for the association. The association has tools of communication, both at its meetings and through websites, in order to be able to get this information out to its membership so that the directors don't feel like they are on an island having to translate this and to make it simpler for its membership.
You know, Henry, two questions came in. I keep monitoring the questions, and I'm going to ask the question for them to you and to Bill. One of them was, what happens when you're an owner and you see structural damage and the board doesn't do anything about it? You know, I'd like to hear what Henry has to say on that. My answer is call your building official, tell your management company, let them document it. And the other one is, what happens when management makes a recommendation, Bill? First Service has, I call it institutional knowledge, meaning when you manage 1,000 high-rise buildings around the country, you have certain institutional knowledge, both on preventative maintenance, how to fix balconies, what to do with waterproofing and the like. What happens when management makes recommendations to hire an engineer and get started, and the board balks at it because of political pressure from the owners? Now, let me make a side note that I think the political pressure is going to be significantly reduced in light of this tragedy. But Bill, what do you do as a management company when the board doesn't want to take your advice?
Well, that's our job, and that's exactly what we're doing today. So there's a long answer to that question, but number one, you do have to make the right recommendations, and our job is to support our board members and our clients, and we're always going to do what's right. It's one of our 6 core values: do what's right. So we will communicate. I also like something Henry just mentioned with regard to communication. You have to have these communication platforms. You have to get all this information out to the membership. What ends up happening is, and what I see, and by the way, I don't want to miss the question about the engineers either. You have a group of folks that may show up to a board meeting or show up to a board meeting in person or online today. It's not the majority of the building. The majority of the building. So when the board is sitting there, we're sitting there with the board members, supporting them, supporting the building. There will be, and there has traditionally been, pressure on the board. This is going to be expensive, and we're going to get into the financials here in just a moment. So I believe that one of the hard recommendations is absolutely communicate all information relevant to keep the entire membership up to speed on what's going on. Memberships today, and board members especially today, they want to know that the proper work is being done, that the proper due diligence is taking place. This is a very personal thing. This is their homes where they receive guests. and family members, and they want to know that their buildings are being taken care of. So that's not just, you know, sending a blast email like it used to be. That's not just posting a notice in the mailroom. That is the blast phone calls. That is effective updating of the community website. That is letting everyone know these are the next steps in what we're doing. So from a management perspective, the board makes the final decision. It's our job to give them the tools, the resources, and support to make the best business decision for their building. One of the things I wanted to highlight, and then Henry, I'm going to go to you. The location of the building does matter, but we've already established today that the historical preventative maintenance of the building matters more. That's a big part of this. So one of the questions that just came in, Sanisha and Greg are going to be very, very busy people. And Henry, we've seen this over the years. There's a certain amount of demand for the right structural engineers. Of course, your professional management team should be able to provide you with a list very quickly. How are we, what's the advice for board members to make sure that we're properly vetting and looking at the right teams that we're going to hire, whether it's for our paint job or a regular inspection, right? The right engineering teams to make sure that we've seen a run on these professionals coming into the state or into the Southeast after disasters before. We've seen this over the years. We've done this. So what are the best practices and learnings to vetting Sanishas and the Gregs of the world?
Bill, I think that the experience that association attorneys like David and I have had, we know how to vet people. We know how to investigate backgrounds. We know how to challenge what is shown on paper. So I think consulting with your management company and your counsel is the way in which to do the initial review of competent, specialized, certified experts in order to address those particular issues. There, of course, are state agencies through which these professionals are licensed. They have certain public reports that are also available. But if you have the right professionals online, there are sources that they have through their contacts in the same agencies and through the same professions that can lead to shortlists for the boards to investigate.
I would go further and say, not only are the lawyers and the management team of your building competent to assist you in finding the right structural or mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineers to help you, whether it's in recertification, whether it's in your painting and preventative maintenance, but to address the issue of the demand that's going to occur for structural engineers, I would argue that self-managed buildings are going to have a much tougher time getting an engineer than a building that's managed by a reputable large management company that has the, I'll use the word buying power to say to a Sanisa, I got 1,000 buildings and there are 4 great engineers in South Florida or 10 or whatever it is, and I need you guys to go through those buildings. They're going to have the ear of the engineers a lot more than an individual building in Port St. Lucie, let's say, who picks up the phone and says, are you busy? Because just like me, people tend to go where the money is. And if you have buying power in the marketplace, you're going to get the ability to get the help, and the squeaky wheel always gets the grease. So, I think First Service actually has an opportunity here to really get with all of the local engineers in your area and help you, where on your own, you're going to be one cry in the dark in the midst of many others crying out for help.
David, I want to stick with you for a second. Greg, I'll come back. And then Henry, I'd like you to answer the critical question just came in. We're getting this a lot. This is with regard to the legal or the liability for board members in unfortunate situations like this. David, could you start with that? And then Henry, I'd love to get your thoughts as well. This is critical to our clients today.
one of the questions going forward, as Henry said, is are people going to be willing to and want to serve on boards? Because I will tell you that given the limited amount of insurance in the Surfside tragedy, anybody and everybody with insurance will be sued, including presumably past boards and the current board, regardless of whether they tried, did a good job. You know, it's not going to matter. They're going to go after the insurance. Boards are required to act with reasonable business judgment. It's called the business judgment rule. And you have the right to rely on your experts. So as long as you are a board that properly utilizes legal services, engineering services, management services, and you listen to the recommendations of those people, you are exercising your reasonable business judgment. On the other hand, if you act willfully, wantonly, recklessly, or intentionally, you do not have immunity from suit. That's in the statute for nonprofits. So for example, what would be willful and wanton and intentional or reckless? If your lawyer says you need to hire an engineer, if your engineer says you need to do this work, if your management company gives you report after report after report saying you've got the engineering study, you've got to do this work right away, and you ignore it for 10 years, and then someone falls off the building because the railing post broke after you were told, fix the railing post, you can be sued. But if you do the right thing and you follow the advice of your experts and your managers and your lawyers and your engineers, you typically cannot be sued. And if you are sued, it will be dismissed because of the business judgment rule.
Henry.
Bill, the protection given by the Florida courts mirrors that given to corporate executives. Decisions of directors generally cannot be questioned by the court unless they rise to that level of fraud or criminal activity or self-dealing or dishonesty or such prolonged gross negligence that the court is bound to say no reasonable person under all of those circumstances would have acted that way unless they were completely incompetent and almost willfully ignoring responsibility and the advice of their professionals. So you have to go a long way to find a director liable for ordinary decision and management decisions that they make in operating an association. Directors need to take comfort in that protection in operating an association, and especially if they are consulting with the right team of experts.
And I think that that's critical. Thank you for that. Now let's take it a step further. Henry, we'll start with you this time and then go to David. It's very unpopular for a board member or any board of directors to sit in front of the membership, and I promise we're going to get to finance right after this, but we have to finance the work. We have to pay for the engineers. We have to do the paint jobs, the concrete restoration. We have reserve schedules and studies. Well, those reserves can be funded or not. We have special assessments. We have lending, and arguably a favorable lending environment. What advice can we give to board members today when they're feeling that pressure from the residents or there's complaining at a board meeting to help them make that proper business decision, if you will, right? And move forward in the face of unpopular political stress?
Transparency, transparency, transparency. Present to the membership in every way available to you at meetings, on the website of the association, what are the financial alternatives? What do they mean long-term? How is the money going to be used in response to what study and to accomplish what? And what is the long-term benefit and cost to the association? And there should also be some attention given to the benefit of the association. Yes, it will cost. Yes, it will cost now. But what is the projected benefit to the association that you anticipate reasonably with consultation either with your engineer or your manager for going down one path versus the other? It's been my experience that yes, there is pain. Yes, there is controversy, but I believe every reasonable person can justify a pathway taken in order to finance what needs to be done. After all, Bill, they are protecting everybody's investment in the property, and they're protecting everybody's well-being.
I have a comment I want to add. David, what's your thoughts on that?
So, you know, the political process of engendering support for an assessment is typically extremely difficult. I've seen the amount of slander that goes around is outrageous, whether it's slander towards management, slander towards the old board, slander towards the new board, slander towards the lawyers, the engineers, everybody in the process. I love Henry's comment about transparency, but I would add something to that. Avoid mudslinging, avoid accusations regarding the prior board and what they didn't do, because then they get resistant and they go against the assessment. Deal and focus with where you are today and less about who did what wrong to get you where you are today, because you are where you are today and you have to address where you are today. One of the questions came in about how do you get a bank loan? Well, if you have a good management company, they direct you to 3 or 4 banks that happen to give loans to condominium associations. And again, that's within the board discretion. Do we get a loan? Don't we? Do we get a 3-year loan, a 5-year loan, a 7-year loan? Those are the kinds of things that cannot be attacked because that's business judgment of the association's board. I would also say that one of the biggest issues that comes up on these assessments, who's watching the money? How do we know how the money's going to be spent? The answers to that are have a very good lawyer review your construction and design contracts so that they are properly done. Get a bond for any work so that if, God forbid, the contractor goes out of business, you have the bonding company or the surety company on the hook. I see Greg smiling, so I know I said something right.
Get an owner rep too.
I've seen too many cases where they paid the money. They gave it to the contractor, and the contractor either did the work wrong and it wasn't properly supervised by a proper engineer. Don't skimp on the engineering oversight. And number 2, get the bond. Make sure you have proper insurances. Your lawyer can draft your construction contract to protect you. If you're doing a $5 million assessment, don't fight with your lawyer over what he's going to charge you to write a proper contract. If you're doing a $5 million assessment, don't skimp on the engineering oversight to make sure the work is done properly.
And
Bill, if I can just add to that, in applying for the loan that David was talking about, the management company can help the association before the application goes in having its records and its paperwork in the proper shape and presentation that lenders look for. There is so much time wasted, in my experience, with examining associations, even with repeat loans, because record keeping was insufficient, was unprofessionally maintained. And in some of those instances, Bill, working with the association's accountant is important in order to facilitate, because just like with everything else, you are applying in competition with others. And if you make yourself presentable as an association as a reliable source of repayment, part of that is reflected by the professionalism of the record keeping. And that's where I think First Service really helps its clients.
If I could jump in, yeah, Henry, I think this is a good segue. Look, if you're dealing with New York and or looking for debt in order to do these projects. As you mentioned, your establishment of the project from both a tangible and intangible aspect need to be to industry standards. And what I mean by that is you need to create a pro forma and a budget that encompass not only your legal costs, your permit costs, your consultants, and everything from an intangible accounting perspective, right? All the way through the tangible costs, which is the physical contractor, the materials, and everything that's being put in place. Now, what you folks have to realize is that with concrete restoration, as Sinisa mentioned originally, a lot of it is unforeseen, all right? And in typical for-profit development scenarios, a typical contingency on an out-of-the-ground project on both hard and soft value is somewhere around 10 to 15% for developers that know what they're doing, time in, time out, and do it every year, okay? A construction project, restoration concrete is something completely of a different animal, specifically because of the unforeseen nature. And unless you estimate that extremely conservatively to the contingency of maybe 50% with multiple opinions of someone like Sinisa or a Thornton Tomasetti or a national brand that does this every single day, you take the worst case scenarios identified by those folks, you put them together for your worstest case scenario before you approach debt or some form of funding source. All right. The worst thing that I see happen is a project is estimated at $1 to $2 million and ends up being 6 or 7.
Well,
And that's when traditional means and methods are not adhered to, and you don't have a professional that's looking out for both hard and soft commitments.
You know, one of the things that comes up, boards always ask, well, how come the engineer can't tell us how much of the rebar is bad? And how come they can't tell us what it's going to cost to do the spalling? I'll give you the answer that I'm aware of as a construction and condo lawyer, and that is you have to go to beyond where it is bad to where it's good. And until you get in there, you don't really know. And when you get priced on a per linear foot or a per square foot basis. No contractor for concrete restoration or remediation of stucco is going to give you a flat price other than if you're ripping off all the stucco and putting it all back on. And the reason is because they don't know how much is delaminated until they get in there, or they don't know how much rebar they need to replace on the balcony until they start. And Greg and Sinisa can explain the technicalities of that, but that's the reality. And so that's why a $2 million job becomes a $5 million job.
So to your point, David, when we as professional developers that are looking for a return on investment go and buy an asset that is an apartment building or an office building that needs to be converted to condos or another use where the structure remains standing, they will spend exorbitant amounts of money in discovery and due diligence. They will basically take the worst identified portions of the building and physically do a destructive test on as many of those areas as possible to define the worst case scenario. Because the last thing a for-profit developer can allowably do without affecting his own pocket is go back to the bank and ask for more money. They're never going to allow it.
So, and let me jump in here, Greg. That's critically important. And one of the questions that we started this conversation was, you know, how do we better support the board? So I see it as two different things, and you've all heard me make this recommendation on these SE Experts panel discussions before. Make sure that we surround you with the right experts. That's part of what this is. No board should ever feel like they're sitting at the table in front of the membership all by themselves, or with the maintenance supervisor, or just the maintenance supervisor and their manager even. That's not how it's successful. You have two different types of situations. The first is the worst situation, and that is a situation that could be considered urgent, emergency, has to happen now, and we need the money right away to do it. Part of what you want to take away, I believe, from this session today is how to avoid that. And it goes back to something Greg said. You want to be as proactive as possible. You want to plan as much as possible. You want to have all of the facts and all the due diligence, and you want to make sure that it's communicated and talked about to the membership. If a membership knows what to expect, you're going to get less pushback at the end of the day. If they know this is coming, if they know this is what we're working on. Another great rule of thumb, even though it's not all of it is certainly not included in the reserve schedule, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is that if you waive reserves, it's a very easy explanation to the membership that your reserve schedule just became your special assessment schedule. So you should just know what that is. Know that at that date and time for that component, you will cut that check to replace that component. If everything, and here's the big if that we talked about, if everything is properly maintained with a comprehensive preventative maintenance program to begin with. If that doesn't exist, then the expected useful life is going to shrink and you're going to have to cut the check sooner. So what other, David, let me start with you here. If we look at it in that context, what other key components of this team? We have engineers on the call today. We have legal counsel. We have property management. Walk us through the CPA, how they should be involved. Perhaps the insurance broker and the valuation of the building that's required. Take us through all of the professionals that we should bring into the room.
That's a great question, Bill. You need a reserve study specialist who's going to reserve not just for your Gabbana furniture and your front doors and your generator, but for the structure itself. You need someone who's not going to do this reserve study remotely, but show up at your building and look at it and analyze it, and may need to talk to your engineer. Your accountant should be involved in your budget every year. Do not try to save money by not having the accountant involved. The accountant's going to have to help you with respect to whether or not it's appropriate to waive or partially waive reserves. I'm going to be involved in trying to promote legislation to avoid or making it more difficult for boards to waive reserves for life safety components such as roof, waterproofing, structural components, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire. Because I think one of the biggest problems that has occurred is you end up with this big mushroom cloud at year 38 that becomes very politically unfeasible and financially unfeasible to many people on fixed income. I think you need your insurance agent involved for multiple reasons. One of which is, are you properly insured? If you are underinsured, your carrier can say, we're not paying the claim because you were only insured for 50% of the value of the replacement of your building. So I believe you need proper insurance advice, you need proper legal advice, you need proper engineering advice, you need proper management advice, but you also need proper reserve study specialists, insurance brokers, and you can even have your insurance brokers, going to what Greg says about getting more than one opinion. If your insurance broker gives you a package, you can then ship that package out to a consultant that does nothing but analyze it. They don't sell you any insurance. Their only job is to analyze your insurance, including all the exceptions, the exclusions, all the different coverages compared to what you need for your building. And it may cost you $10,000. It may be the best $10,000 you ever spent in your life. So there are these other experts that you need, and you need to rely upon them. And you don't just rely upon them after the fact. You rely upon them in order to come up with a comprehensive plan on how to run your building.
I want to go around the horn on this. Henry, what does it look like in a board meeting? I'm really focused right now on making sure the boards have the support they need to do what's right comfortably. but doesn't it change the board meeting when you have a Greg or a Sanisha or legal counsel or the CPA or the insurance broker there explaining the technicalities to the membership and really supporting the board?
I think the attendees today have heard about a task force that has been organized in Florida to look into the tragedy down at Surfside, and it's composed of Florida bar members who are talking about possible revisions to the statute, and to which David has also referred. The point, Bill, is that condominium self-management is not going to change. There's not going to be an overlay of people making ultimate business decisions for the associations other than the directors. So the directors are going to be in the position of exercising their customary empowered decision-making under the Condominium Act, maybe with some more direction, some more limitations from whatever results from the upcoming legislative session and this task force. But in order to do so, our message is that the directors need a team. And it's not just at board meetings, Bill. They need to implement the team and to have that team or to communicate that team's input every single month. Every time that there's a publication on the website, every single meeting, even on periodic newsletters out to the membership, to show the membership that there is ongoing input being absorbed in order to get this right. That is the way, I think, in which boards are able to win the confidence of their memberships in order to tackle the very hard issue of how much to assess or how much to borrow for the association.
Greg, as I said, around the horn, talk about a success story where the team has all come together, right? Engineers, construction, accounting, insurance. Tell me how that helps to protect the board, but really ensure, right, that the project gets done on time and as close to or within budget as possible. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, a team environment is always better than a resistful environment. If you've constantly got owner meetings where you're constantly arguing the direction of the professionals you've hired, you stand to put yourself in a very, very tight position, especially if those professionals are giving you their expert opinion. Pursuant to what David and Henry have both said in the last 20 minutes, those folks have been hired, whether it was by the existing board or this board, to ensure the safety and upkeep of your building. They are not doing it to upset you. They're not doing it up to drive the bill up, because if you've hired the right professionals, there are going to be professionals that will challenge certain aspects on your behalf. And it is not solely based upon the money aspect. So anytime you can hire professionals that are a cohesive team that get you to the finish line, that is what your primary focus is for, because their fiduciary responsibility by their licensing is to your property and your project.
I think that's one of the critical roles of management, if I may for a moment, is really supporting the board to make sure that the team comes together. And everyone's already mentioned it. The contracts need to be reviewed by the legal counsel of the association. The contractor's certificates of insurance need to be reviewed by the insurance broker of the association.
And honestly,
and
all of
so
those
on and so forth.
All of those items should be collected by your owner rep, reviewed by your owner rep, so that you're not passing on those items to your attorney if they're not complete. There are multiple layers of primary function, traditional means and methods that on so many occasions are not followed because of pressure to save money.
I've seen situations where people have done a contract for remediation and restoration, that started as $400,000, which was on two sheets of paper. Basically, it was a proposal. And then they change ordered it up to millions of dollars with no proper AIA contract, with no attorney review. That's what needs to be avoided. And that's where management really, you need every orchestra needs a conductor and every airplane needs a pilot. And you can't have, and I use this analogy, I don't remember if it was with one of the journalists I was speaking to last week. You have 150 people and they're on the same plane and they're all paying ticket price to get to a place. You can't all fly the plane, okay? And even your board doesn't have the expertise to file a flight plan and run an airplane and operate it. They need to rely on the experts. The management company needs to be the director or the person who helps get these people to execute. And you have to listen to your professionals because you can't fly a plane on your own.
Well, we are. We're all in this together. And Greg, 1 second. Sanisha, I want to pull you in and get your comments as well with regard to the professional team support approach for each community.
Sure. Everything that my fellow panelists have mentioned, I support 100%. But I think everything starts with one statement I think David made earlier, and that is the trust. I think that everything starts with trust. You are hiring your professionals not because you don't trust them. You're hiring them because you want their specialty, you want their advice on things that you are not well versed in. So if you're hiring somebody and from the get-go you're not trusting them, that's a lose-lose situation. So if you're hiring somebody to be your advisor, then you have to rely on the information of that person. I heard this sentence somewhere, and I think it's what the mentality should be. You have to trust your advisor, but maintain the healthy dose of paranoia. I think, we shouldn't take everything for granted, but like Greg said, if you don't really agree 100%, don't just dismiss it. Maybe ask for a second opinion, but make sure that second opinion is also from a reputable company, somebody that's comparable to the company that you are already discussing or advisor you're discussing. So critical parts of all of this. I don't know how many times I said this, but attorneys are a really invaluable part of your negotiations. Anything done without attorneys, in my opinion, when it comes to contracts, is destined to fail. So you have to have somebody protecting your legal interest. Your property managers, and I have to say this, your property managers are not project managers. I know a lot of buildings that rely on property managers and maintenance teams to be, oh yeah, my manager is going to check this, and my manager and my chief engineer knows all of this. They're there to run your building for day-to-day operation. They're there to bring the problems to the attention of the outside professionals to assist with that, but they're not there to run a construction project, whether it's a cooling tower replacement, a general replacement, or a full-blown concrete restoration. They still have to have their day-to-day operation. Your manager still has to deal with move-ins, move-outs, with accounting and all of that. So that's why you have to have a project manager helping with that. Then your engineer is a professional, is going to take all the liability for the project when it comes to designing the project, when it comes to supervision, when it comes to reporting to the city. We are missing one important segment. Everybody spoke about attorneys, engineers, and all what, but the contractors. Contractors are the key part of this at the end, because arguably the largest amount of money is going to be paid to them.
Right.
So we need to make sure that we are hiring a reputable contractor that is being vetted by your management company, and not just through the references that they give you, but as David said, through an institutional knowledge that a large companies offer, through experiences of other managers that may not be on that reference list. So you need to do your homework in hiring all of those professionals. The point is, the building shouldn't be alone in this. And I understand that money is an issue. I don't pretend to live, in a makeup world. I know that in a real world, money is an issue. But if we combine a lot of things we said, such as going back to a 3,000-mile oil change, if you inspect your building regularly on, let's say, 7 to 10 year interval, with or without city or state regulations, if you address the issues as they show up and guided by professionals, I think you're going to be very rarely in the situation that you have to come up with $10 million in 3 days or in 3 months. You may be having to spend $1 million or $2 million every 10 years, but very rarely are you going to be in a situation of 10, 15, $20 million assessment because you let something go unattended for 30 years. David also mentioned reserves. Reserves are critical, and I would agree the structural or the systems of your building have to be on those reserves, because that is what's going to give you a plan, a flight plan. I like that analogy, a flight plan of your building, basically saying every 7 or 10 years you're painting, every 20 years you're changing the cooling tower, every 15 you're replacing the waterproofing. And that is what is guiding you to properly maintain your building. But also that requires a professional. So I think that I try to summarize all of that we spoke and put it in a a little bit of a lengthy elevator pitch.
No, Sanisha, that's perfect, and I really appreciate that. We're getting to the end of our session today. I want to take a moment to advise everyone on the session today that all of our panelists' contact information is there in the chat if you'd like to take note of that. And of course, this session has been recorded as well. But I think, yes, Sanisha.
I'm sorry.
Real quick.
Because I'm an engineer, a lot of people ask the question, we are focusing on mid-rise, high-rise buildings and design. I just want to say that all the buildings, all residential buildings or commercial buildings that are supposed to be occupied are designed with the same scrutiny or with the same laws and regulations. So there is no special law for high-rise versus a low-rise building. It's the design is the same. We always design building with the same design intent. So all the buildings are designed the same standard.
Well, I think it's important to, thank you for that, Sanisha. I think it's important to let the board members know. And we also have property management professionals and other professionals in the industry on the call that nobody's in this alone. The situation that we've all witnessed over the past couple of weeks has been tragic. And what we'd like to do is make sure that we're intelligent about this, we take learnings away from this, and we don't let it happen again. I also would like to just highlight something that was mentioned earlier, that we don't know exactly what the cause was yet. This investigation probably, I'm guessing, is going to go on for at least a couple of years. So our job in the meantime is to conduct ourselves appropriately, do the due diligence that's mentioned, bring your team together to ensure your success and make sure you have all the support you need to be successful in your building. So having said that, David, Henry, Greg, Sanisha, I want to thank you all so very much for your time and support, recommendations, and expertise today. We really do appreciate it. We appreciate our relationship and partnering with you all to help ensure the success of these communities. And to our attendees, we hope that you were able to take away 1 or 2 or hopefully 6 or 7 items back to your community today that will help you, guide you as you move forward. Please reach out to any of us with any needed support that you have moving forward. And we hope that that value is there for you. And we sincerely thank you all for your time. So having said that, group, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. And until our next Ask the Experts panel discussion, we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.